Hi everyone, and welcome to the last little part of the lecture. Here I want to talk a little bit about how we use the IPA to transcribe words. So with the IPA, it's really important to make sure that you are trying not to be biased by how a word is spelled in English. So here we have the English word do, spelled D-O. Here we have the IPA transcription of it, using the English symbol D and the English symbol U. If you recall from the previous lectures, the D makes a D sound and the U makes an U sound. So that's D, U, or do. So basically, we have a little bit of a mismatch between the IPA and the English spelling. That you'll find that happening frequently enough, not necessarily every time, but it's going to be important to remember that the English and the IPA won't always match up. This will happen frequently with vowels, where we have symbols in the IPA that are not in English. So we have the sound in tough or put, the sound in put, the S sound in head or checks. It will also happen when sometimes in English we have two letters like GH representing one sound. So in tough, the GH represents F, but in the IPA we just have the letter F for that. So it's going to be important to remember that English and IPA spellings won't necessarily match up. When you are trying to figure out what sounds to use in the IPA to represent an English word, you can kind of work sound by sound, just sound out the word. So, for example, in tough, we have the T, and we have the and we have the F. There's really three sounds there. So you could say the T uses the letter T sound. Try to figure out what vowel we have with which is this upside down V looking thing, and then which consonant we have F, which corresponds to the F in IPA. So on tests and quizzes, if I am asking you to provide an IPA transcription for an English word, it will be multiple choice. So I will give you, for example, 4 different possible transcriptions of the word do and ask you to choose which you think is the right one. So that should probably make things a little less intimidating, hopefully. But the IPA is, I know, new to probably just about all of you. But just try to remember that you can always have the charts in front of you, and if you work from those IPA charts, things should probably be a lot more smooth. So to kind of lead into next week, I will mention one thing called coarticulation. So coarticulation is when we have one sound that is pronounced and then the next sound is already kind of being produced. So our speech organs, or our tongue, our lips, everything in our mouth are kind of getting ready to say the next sound while we're still saying the current one. Another term for this is articulatory overlap, but basically this phenomenon kind of gives way to the next field of linguistics we'll look at, which is called phonology. So next week we'll be looking at how sounds are pronounced when they're together, rather than how sounds are pronounced in isolation like we have so far in this week. So phonetics that we've looked at is sounds on their own. Phonology that we'll look at next week is when sounds work together. So that's really the last slide I have to talk about this week. There are several more slides in the PDF I've put up on Learn of the lectures. If you happen to have the book and be interested in extra material in the field, I can kind of zoom through those really quick. I won't say too much about them. But there are a few more fields of linguistics, there are a few more aspects of phonetics that linguists would look at. For us in this class, we're just interested with English phonetics, and we're not going to be looking at the phonetics so much of other languages. When we look at phonology next week, we will be looking at other languages, though. So if you want to stop looking at this lecture now, you can. Remember that we do have a quiz that is due Friday. It's 10 questions. You have 25 minutes to do it, and you have 2 attempts at it. So you can try to learn from your mistakes, see what you did wrong, and try to correct it for the next time. And the best attempt you make will be graded. So I'm going to kind of go through a few more slides really quick. It's not so important for the class, but if you're just interested in some extra material, it is following this slide. So phonetic typology is when we look at sounds in other languages that don't necessarily occur in English and just try to basically see what sounds are there in these other languages, and just kind of out of interest or out of academic interest, just try to see what sounds does English have that these languages don't, what sounds do those languages have that English doesn't, and just compare languages and see how they're the same and different to each other. For example, other languages have velar fricatives, which English doesn't have. They have uvular sounds, which English doesn't have. And they have retroflex sounds, which English doesn't have. So if you saw that IPA chart, then you may recognize that there were a lot of blank squares there for English. Other languages might have those squares filled in with a sound, and they might not have sounds where English has them. So just because English has a sound doesn't mean all languages will have it. And kind of as a follow-up to that, English doesn't have all the sounds that other languages might have. There are also different suprasegmentals to the sounds of language. So suprasegmentals are kind of levels to the sounds of language that are above just the basics of the speech organs that we've been talking about. So some of these suprasegmentals are syllables, stress, tone, and intonation. The reason they're called suprasegmentals is that they can range over several sounds in a language. Sorry, several sounds in a sentence. So basically a syllable is going to be several sounds. For there to be stress in a word, we need there to be multiple sounds. The same with tone and intonation. So a syllable is a grouping of sounds that has a peak, or which is usually a vowel, and this peak has a consonant either before or after it, or both. So the syllable, the nucleus is what I called the peak before. The nucleus is the most prominent or loudest part of the syllable. Typically in English, this will be a vowel. It doesn't always have to be, but most commonly it will be a vowel. The onset are any consonants in the syllable that come before the peak, and then the coda is any consonants that follow the peak. We can have syllabic consonants, so a syllable doesn't necessarily have to have a vowel, so consonants can function as the syllable nucleus. If we were transcribing these, which we won't have to in this class, the syllabic consonants would have a little line underneath them. But as examples of syllabic consonants, we have the final ol in little, we have the final in butter, the final n in button, and the final m in prism. So for example, in prism, we have the n at the end is a syllable on its own. So we have a syllable, pris, with a vowel, and we have a syllable m without a vowel. So we can have syllables both with and without vowels. So we have a 2-syllable word, but it actually only has one vowel. Languages can also have stress, and in fact most languages do, including English. So in stress, when a language or a word has stress, the syllable that is stressed will be more prominent. So basically that means it will be pronounced for longer, maybe be pronounced more loudly, maybe be pronounced in a different pitch. So for example, we can have initial stress in English, so the first syllable is stressed. So we have insight, we have record, we have defense, or we can have final stress. We can have incite, we can have record, or we can have defense. So when we have insight versus incite, we have two different words with different meanings. Despite having the same sounds, they have stress in different places, so we get different meanings there. We have record. This is record here, and then we have record here. So record is a noun versus record is a verb. Then we have defense, which is something from sports. Then we have defense, which is something from law. If we were transcribing stress, which we don't need to in this class, we would do it with a little apostrophe before the stressed syllable. So for example, incite gets the apostrophe just before the sight syllable. If it was insight, then we would have the apostrophe just before the in syllable. Tone is something that English doesn't really have, but a lot of Asian languages and a few other languages do. So with tone, we can have the same sound, but depending on whether the pitch in the sound is rising, falling, high, or low, we can actually have different meanings there. So for example, in Mandarin Chinese, here we have 4 different meanings from the same basic set of sounds ma, but depending upon the pitch that is used when you're pronouncing ma, you actually get the different meanings. So ma with a high tone will mean mother. Ma with a tone that's high and rising will mean hemp. Ma with a tone that's low but falling then rising will mean horse. And ma with a tone that's high and then falling will mean scold. So Mandarin Chinese, as you saw, had those 4 tones, but languages can have a whole bunch of tones. So here's an example of a language, Miao or Hmong, that has 8 different tones. So we have this word ta that, depending on the tone that's used, can mean a girl's name, it can mean to be hunchbacked, it can mean to cut, to bump against, a man's name, with, to take, or a small stool. So these little graphs here kind of represent the tone. So the first tone here would be like a middle tone. The 5th tone would be a tone that is rising. The 6th tone would be a tone that's also rising, but not as high as the 5th tone. So you can kind of see the basic shape of the tones with these little graphs. But languages can have a whole lot of tones. English doesn't have them. Mandarin has a few. Hmong has 8. So there is quite a bit of variance in the world's languages there. So finally, we have a quick question. Try to think about this sentence here. I like cheesecake. Think about if you can say it a few different ways to imply things differently. So like, for example, I could say, I like cheesecake, emphasizing I, to say that I like cheesecake, but maybe you don't. I could say, I like cheesecake, meaning I like it versus hating it. I could say, I like cheesecake. So what I would mean there is something like, I like cheesecake versus liking carrot cake. So depending on where I am putting a stress in the sentence, like which word I am emphasizing, we can have a different implied meaning. This is something called intonation. So intonation is when we have a change in pitch that occurs during a phrase versus during in a word. So when we looked at tone and when we looked at stress, that was kind of emphasizing different parts of a word. Intonation is when we emphasize different parts of a sentence. So intonation can actually show a difference in meaning. We can say a statement in English if we have a sentence that is kind of having a fall in pitch at the end. We can say the same sentence and have a rise in pitch at the end to indicate a yes-no question instead of a statement. So, for example, I could say, you went to the store yesterday. I have a slight fall in pitch with yesterday, and I'm kind of just saying a statement that you went to the store yesterday. But if I say, you went to the store yesterday, and have a rise in pitch at the end there, asking you a question, like, did you go to the store yesterday? So, depending on the intonation in a sentence, we can convey a different meaning. So that is all I have for you this week. Don't forget about the quiz. If you have any questions about the IPA charts, if you're worried about anything, you can go ahead and message me. So there is a quiz this week. There is no discussion. Just remember with the quiz, you do get 2 attempts. So, if you take 1 attempt and you're worried about how you did, you do get another attempt. But just remember to ask questions if you have them, and I will try to be as available to you as I can to answer.